Greetings. Bill Stewart is a cooperative extension forestry specialist, and he's co-director of the Center for Forestry at the University of California, Berkeley. His current areas of research and extension focus on the linkages between managed forests and climate change, economic aspects of fire-adapted silviculture in California, and succession planning with family forest owners. With that, Bill, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Thanks for coming here and listening to this. I just want to, today I want to frame this discussion around some of the issues that determine the economic benefits of different types of forest management approaches that have both water and fire benefits. Unlike some of the earlier talks, I'm going to be framing this around a kind of a framework of creating more benefits, not trying to avoid costs, which I find hard to actually measure. Most of the numbers here are going to come from a project we're doing here at the University of California, Berkeley, along with UC Merced, called the Sierra Nevada Watershed Ecosystem Enhancement Project. The origin of this talk came when Otis Wallen was intrigued by some examples I gave him of some projects that, some revenue-generating projects of forest management, one at Collins Pine and then some at Blodgett Forest, which basically involve taking fairly dense stands of trees. These are the stands after they're treated, but taking the stands, opening up the stands so the tree tops don't touch, and fixing the fuel loading on the ground, and still making a profit. And Otis was always wondering, well, can these projects, how often can these be done? How many acres of California look like this? And if it's not a perfect site, is there still something you can do? So this is basically just some of the results of 4 of these different types of projects we've done. And so I just wanted to give an idea for especially the foresters in the room, comparing some of these sites. Some of you know that what basal area is basically the cross-section of the trees, all the trees in an acre of land at 4.5 feet off the ground. And then you can see trees per acre is a fairly common number. So you see in the 2 units at Blodgett, which is the 1 unit we have on the entranceway, there are 2 sequential units. We started with 180 trees, and then we dropped down to roughly 150. So we took out about 20% of the trees, of the basal area, excuse me, and then dropped the number of trees down to a fairly low number to maintain a very open stand that actually we had, and also treated the fuels on the floor. In those projects, we weren't able to sell any of the chips because we had no market for them. But they were produced, but they were just burned on site. The 2 other projects, the Collins Pine site and our Blodgett Plantation, you can see there's the much bigger reduction in the amount of trees measured in basal area, about a 40% reduction, and even a larger reduction in the number of trees per acre because we're mainly taking out the smaller trees. And in both those projects, we did sell the chips. About a third of the total volume harvested went to energy plants, and 2/3 of it went to sawmills. I think it's important to realize that in most of these projects, the chips they're really not that valuable. In some areas, we actually lost money a little bit on selling the chips. But it's safer and safer than actually burning them in large piles. But not all sites in California have this amount of forest inventory to actually work with to reduce fire risk. So another big question many people have had is, if you did these projects, logic suggests that there are fewer trees out there, there's going to be less water used by the plants, and potentially more water is going to run off through the groundwater into the streams and down into the reservoirs and hydroelectric plants downstream. So one question as many people have asked, what's the value of all that extra water if it actually got into the reservoirs and the systems below it? And so as we all know with the drought, there's a lot of question of how much more water is going to be worth if it's going to be sent to the city of Santa Clara or used for almond orchards. And there's various different prices. So what I've done here is give examples of numbers. If someone in a city or a farmer was willing to pay to get more water from a forest, what are some different values they pay? They'd still have to pay to transport the water to their site. And then also to look at different places, well, if that water before it was delivered to the farmer or the city went through some hydroelectric turbines, would it be worth? How much would it be worth? So, well, we looked at those projects that I showed you on the previous page. Based on the reduction in leaf area of the trees, I estimated before the forest would regrow and need to be retreated, there'd probably be about 3 acre-feet of extra water that may run off of that site. And so what this shows is the value of that water. If it's worth $50 an acre-foot at the Blodgett or Collins site, that basically that project would have produced $150 worth of water benefits in addition to the timber and the chips values. If someone values the water, like during a drought at a higher level, it could be worth more. The numbers on the right for Deer Creek and Lake Almanor show the additional value that you could get if some of that water also went through hydroelectric turbines owned by PG&E, Southern California Edison, or some other entity. So you see, if there's hydroelectric power, in some cases, especially in some high elevation reservoirs, the hydroelectric value might even be more than the diversion value. So these are some of the just basic graphs going back to that same point of evidence with a lot of scatter, but there's evidence that if you do reduce the amount of forests and basically replace that with essentially grasses, that you will get an increase, reduction in the amount of evapotranspiration, the water used by the plants that should be running off. So these are just 2 graphs showing there is a difference, but also I think the important issue is to show that it's not, the results are not tightly, don't tightly follow a line. So there's lots of area that uncertainty how much water yield you may get. And from a business idea, business proposition, there's the challenge of trying to explain to your partners how much extra water something's going to do, and therefore how much they should pay you to do that. That's one of the great challenges of these projects, that there's just a great deal of uncertainty, and we're not exactly sure is it due to the precipitation or the geology or the trees. Another point, I just want to go back to look at what type of, this is the question that Otis asked, well, how many forests look like those ones at Blodgett that have lots of inventory, a variety of tree sizes? And so this shows the comparison of private forest land on the left, Blodgett Forest, where we, because the University of California manages it, we know a lot about all the stands there. And then the right, the U.S. Forest Service timberlands, and then areas that are in wilderness or parks. So the white bar shows that in the middle there's the dark black bar. That shows the median amount of biomass out there on the stand. To the right of that you see these smaller bars, and what that is just the total biomass in trees less than 25 centimeters, which is 10 inches in diameter. And the key point is that those small trees, even though they're very visible when you stand in the forest, they don't actually account for much of the biomass or much of the leaf area or the water use in these forests. That if we're going to do forest management, we are going to have to actually do some management of the trees larger than 10 inches in diameter, because those are the ones that are using most of the water. This here on the left is a map of California, the light blue are the different major river basins coming out of the Sierra Nevada, and the types of forest that we have here. And the basic issues you see mainly the mixed conifer forest, which is the green checked area in the northern California. In the southern Sierra, we actually have more red fir forests that are in this region, which are often in wilderness areas and parks, so there's less management going on there. But the mixed conifer is really the main type of forest, especially in Northern California. On the right is a map of, that's the Lake Almanor Basin, and the thin yellow lines around there are timber harvest plans that have been filed and are mapped on the watershed mapper web tool that FRAP has on the website. And this basically shows you the different patterns of ownerships that in any watershed you're going to have owners, that some of them that do small projects, which are usually clear cuts. Some of the timber harvest plans are much larger, over large areas, probably thinning projects. And the areas that have no yellow lines are probably owned by the Forest Service, because they don't file their projects with the state of California. So the main point here is that anytime you think about organizing a project all over large areas for forests, fire and water benefits, you're going to have a number of different landowners and land managers involved. So I think, finally, when we're thinking about this, I think a key for all of us to think about is if we're going to do a project, there needs to be some easy-to-use metrics that account for the major variables we're trying to track. And so the ones I see are what are really kind of how to understand what that forest stand looks like. One is clearly the number of really big trees per acre, not just the small trees or all the trees. Also to think about the volume of biomass, the amount of leaf area that's out there, and how fast that forest is growing. Or if it isn't growing, what's happening in terms of wildfires, insects, or disease losses. The second point is that we all know that right now we have some fires going on in very flammable Southern California, but there's very differences in regional regional weather and the fire risk. And within those, each stand at the forest level, it's going to have a different level of risk based on where the fuels are in that stand. So those are areas that need to have some consistent measurements so that we can compare different sites to understand where we would want to go if we're going to do a project, and how we'd actually evaluate if there'd been an improvement in the project over time. And finally, we're talking here about water, is to understand the water use that is by the plants, not just the trees, but also the shrubs and the grasses that are on the sites, and develop better water balances so we know that from the precipitation that falls on it, how much is going to be used by the plants and how much might be flowing downhill. So to do this, one of the projects we did is we used the Forest Service program called the Forest Vegetation Simulator, which is a way to actually take real lists of trees that have been counted by foresters or forestry aides, and then put them into a model and then see how they would grow if they grew based on historical knowledge of how trees of that size grew in those types of stands. And this on the left shows you they have some nice graphics. You're able to track how the forest will grow over 10, 20, and 30 years. So I think part of the reason of doing a model is to try to get at what we all know is reduce the repetition of the very large fires we've been having in California, such as this is a picture of the rim fire where it's burned most of the trees within much of the area of that very large fire. And also to link forest management to what is all across the Sierra Nevada is a lot of developed water infrastructure. This is a canal running through that actually connects the Yuba River watershed, and actually eventually some of that water is transferred to the Bear River watershed. So in both those areas, in these areas often the water value is often as high or higher than the forest value in this area. So I think to do this, what I suggest is that it's really important to think, even though forest landowners or land managers don't think about paying for water, they do need to start thinking about how much water their trees are using. And this is really the way that the farmers downslope think about managing their trees, that they really do have to think about how much water each tree is using and how much tree growth, or in this production, almond growth or economic value is coming from that water application. So to do that, what I think if you think about a farm manager, they're really going to try to figure out measuring how much water is actually used by their plants and decide how much water they are going to pay for the irrigation water. They track the water, but also how much water is going to be used. So this is some examples of how researchers have tried to understand the value of how much water is being used by plants of different sizes. And this is these are a plantation of a ponderosa pine that was from left 9 years old, and it grew over time. And you see over time, as the trees got older, they used more water because they had more leaf area. So they're basically more area to transpire the water. And you also see that in the 12th year that the shrubs started to regrow, and they started to use a lot of water also. It's important to realize that shrubs are very different than trees, and they're about 3 times as efficient per unit of leaf area in using water. So if an area has if there's 3 times as much tree area, leaf area as there is shrub area, they might be using the same amount of water. So thinking about water use and shrubs is an important issue of understanding the water balance in California's forests. This is just some data, no need to try to understand this, but we do have actually reasonable measurements of comparing on the x-axis is the amount of area of forest, of trees, and then on the y-axis is the volume of shrubs at different sites. And the public forests and private forests are not that dissimilar in terms of generally the more forest cover you have and shade, the fewer shrubs you have, but you still have actually quite a variation and quite large amounts of shrubs within forests of different numbers of trees. Finally, this is something that is reasonably convincing to me is that, well, when the question is what can we actually measure out there in the forest, is you can measure the volume of the basal area of the trees. That's something it's right at breast height. You can walk up and measure it and then try to get an idea, well, if we have this amount of basal area, how much leaf area is out there? And that's what's really using, that's kind of what directly is going to be driving how much water is used. And this is as you can see, a lot of scatter, but there's a central tendency that actually as trees get more trees there's going to be more water use. And so we can use this relationship to essentially predict how much water the trees are using, and therefore, depending on how much precipitation is there, how much might be left over to flow downhill. So finally, I think to go, from an economics point of view to action, I think there's 4 points here important to remember. One is that we need to ensure that be able to not just manage the forests for just water alone. There's a lot of important wildlife habitat, water quality issues. But once we have done that, to actually make sure we have metrics for the 3 different goals we have. Growing the big trees that California's forests are known for, reducing fire risk, and thinking about water flow. And each one of those requires different ways of measuring the forest. And secondly, I think we're going to need to have, there are models that suggest that there are economically sustainable ways of doing this that involve, first of all, probably the most clear revenue source is from the saw logs, but also the potential of potentially selling additional water and potentially working with fire agencies if people do certain activities that's actually going to reduce the long-term costs of firefighting in California. But to involve the water agencies like maybe the city of Santa Clara or San Francisco and the hydroelectric owners, there really does need to be a better water balance to show that the water beneficiaries, that they would actually get more water if certain treatments are done and potentially get them to invest in those types of projects. So I think finally what I see in doing this is there's a need to have really tree-based management plans. We really do need to not just look at there's 100 acres of forest here, but how many trees are there and how many leaves are on those trees, and then develop detailed prescriptions of what we're going to do in terms of treating, working with the forest, the big trees, the small trees, where we're going to do it within a watershed, and then really how we're going to do it. Are we going to do it with prescribed burning or with mechanical treatments to move on? But I think if we do these 4 steps, it should be possible to get some interesting pilot projects to learn from in California. So these are just a few references, and so I want to thank you for listening to this presentation, and if there's any questions, I'd be glad to take them. Thank you.